Each year, the International Day of Peace is observed around the world on September 21st. The United Nations General Assembly has declared this as a day devoted to strengthening the ideals of peace through observing 24 hours of nonviolence and ceasefire. But achieving true peace entails much more than laying down arms. It requires the building of societies where all members feel they can flourish. It involves creating a world in which people are treated equally, regardless of their race. The 2022 theme for the International Day of Peace is End Racism, Build Peace, the subject of this evening's webinar.
War. Bob Marley basically took the language, explicit language from the speech given by Haile Selassie at the United Nations in 1963. Until that day, the dream of lasting peace, until the philosophy that holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and totally discredited and abandoned, everything is war. Until that day, the dream of lasting peace, world citizenship, there will be no lasting peace. I invite you to listen to the song, read the song, and Bob has done this many times, did this many times in his career, taken the words from prophetic statements, speeches. Perhaps some of you guys know the words from Mosiah Garvey, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. So that's a huge gift of Bob. I think definitions are very important as we move into the talk. For racism, I'd like to use the definitions that I work with. I happen to work with another group called Skill in Action. We are a group of healthcare workers. We're a group of yoga teachers. Hello. And we also do work in anti-racism training and social justice training, particularly for the wellness communities. Again, racism for us and for me equals race prejudice plus social and institutional power. Racism equals a system of advantage based on race. Racism equals a system of oppression based on race. Racism equals a system designed to build and maintain white supremacy or supremacy of one race over another. And also racism can be cultural, racism can be institutional, racism can be personal. That means the personal has to do with the prejudice and the views that you see here. The system has to do with the institutions and the organizations in which we live. The culture has to do with the culture that surrounds all of us, and all these three pieces impact all of us all the time. I'm going to stop sharing the screen from here and move into a space about peace. There are so many different definitions of peace. There's the peace building, there's the peace and security. There are definitions that people have in cultures all over the world. I would like to argue that the world deserves the opportunity to have a conversation about what peace means today. I will come back to the larger part of my argument, which is I also think we have a mechanism within the United Nations to have a global conversation about what peace is, what it should be, and what it should look like for individuals, for communities, for nation states, and the world. So I also think it's very important as we talk about race to also begin to create a shared understanding about race. As an evolutionary systems ecologist in graduate school, I had the question, we were doing evolutionary biology and looking at different species, and I wanted to choose the species of Homo sapiens. The folks in graduate school were not that excited about it. Why don't you choose another animal? And I said, I think Homo sapiens are very interesting. But I think to also begin to, at this point in human history, for us to even know where we started or have a discussion if there's a debate about where we started. And basically, we began to move across the planet And as we moved across the planet, our phenotypes began to change. So that if you're, I have brown skin, I have a tightly coiled hair, that's from my African lineage that would protect me from the tropical suns. As we began to move around the world, our phenotypes began to change. But now here we are today encountering each other as never before. In that whole journey, we have created cultures, we have created language, we have created religions, we have even created the social construct of race.
When you look at the connection between nuclear weapons and race, I don't see how you can not say that they are linked and they are connected. Why did 85% of the American public a week after the atomic bombings agree with Truman's decision? Why did 22% of the American public in a Roper poll a week later say that they wish Japan hadn't surrendered so we could have dropped more nuclear weapons and killed more people, right? Because at that time, there was a genocidal race hatred against the people of Japan that has been unprecedented in our nation's history, where every image of them was of yellow vermin and roaches and monkeys, right? But that wasn't the case with Germans. We were very careful to separate Nazis from Germans and Italians from fascists, but not Japan. They were all guilty for Pearl Harbor. And yes, I see quickly in the chat, of course, the Iraqis. Yes, same concept was done when we talk about Iraq or during that war. And so when we look at nuclear weapons, whether it is uranium mining, right, whether it is in the Belgian-controlled Congo for so long or Native American lands, when we look at nuclear testing with French Polynesia and the Marshall Islands, but also in the Sahara and Africa, when we think about Kazakhstan and Australian Aborigines, it's always a people of color. How many African-American veterans were used as atomic veterans where we tested nuclear weapons on them and did not tell them what we were doing? How many African-Americans were told to get these jobs in Hanford and Oak Ridge and the Savannah River Project to clean up nuclear spills, given no protection, no health care, and never taken care of? Right? It's always the same thing. And whether it is active malice or passive indifference really doesn't matter. But these are the people that we ignore, right, in this narrative. Ralph Ellison says it, cuts right to the chase, third line of his classic work, Invisible Man. I'm invisible, you see, because you choose not to see me. So we pretend to ignore what has been done to people of color as a result of nuclear weapons over and over and over again. And how ironic, how sick is it that three of the biggest nuclear powers, France, the United States, and the UK, all have a history of slave owning and colonialism. Russia having its own history of internal slavery, right? So this idea of colonialism and racism and militarism, something King always talked about in his triple evils, right? That they are connected. And so it is no wonder when we see this, that there was always, since 1945, a response and a protest and action in the Black community in the United States. Whether it was W.E.B. Du Bois, whether it was Paul Robeson, or later when it was people ignore the great Bayard Rustin. It was Bayard Rustin who saw when the French wanted to be a nuclear power and test their first nuclear weapon in the Sahara. He saw the connections between what was happening here with the civil rights movement, what was going on there in the Sahara. He saw that in the late 1950s, whether it was Emmett Till being heinously murdered, Rosa Parks for refusing to give her seat up on the bus, the Great Bandung Conference in Indonesia, this anti-colonialism, anti-white supremacy, and anti-nuclear weapon conference. And so Kwame Nkrumah's rising to power with independence. Algeria's in a fight for independence, and all of this was coming together. It was Bayard Rustin who put that team together of activists from Great Britain and from Africa with Nkrumah to try to stop that French test. But we ignore him because he was gay, right? So he's marginalized from the civil rights movement. He's marginalized from the Black freedom movement. So we don't want to talk about Bayard Rustin. I know that the Obama's production company are putting together a documentary and film on Bayard Rustin for Netflix. I wonder if they will look at his long, rich history of activism in the international arena and in the disarmament arena, or will they only focus on the things like the March on Washington, put him in a nice, neat, categorical little box, right? Instead of looking at his full body of work and how these things are related. It was, of course, people like Lorraine Hansberry, somebody that we all know for Raisin in the Sun, but she was so much more than that, right? We reduced these people down to one thing. Here was a woman who was a socialist, a feminist, an activist in so many ways, learned about nuclear weapons and disarmament from one of her mentors, the great Jimmy Baldwin. This is a woman who went and saw a documentary on Hiroshima and came out of the theater saying, no more Hiroshimas, not now, not ever. The last play that she ever wrote was about a nuclear holocaust and what happens to the survivors. So throughout this history, of course, Martin Luther King was vital in this, as we all know, and with his, talking about triple evils, but also talking about what does it matter if we're drinking out of the same water fountains if we're dead from nuclear war? What does it matter if we achieve the social justice, but then we're not here because of nuclear war? That makes no sense. And he was learning so much of this from his wife. Coretta was such a long season activist dating back to her days at Antioch College. She had been involved in Women's Strike for Peace, Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. When we look at the relationship between race and nuclear weapons in this country, we look at the economic factors, right? In the 1980s, when Reagan was cutting so much money in social programs that largely benefited the poor and the African-American community, and bloated the nuclear budget to all-time highs, there were so many that looked and said, this is wrong, we have to do something about it. And that continues today. Why are we spending $1 trillion on nuclear weapons when we have enough to end the world multiple times over? And I'm being told that 30 minutes away from me, parents are already being told to bring space heaters in this winter because their kids in Baltimore may not have heat in their schools. These are the connections that we need to make and how these things are related. And so in the 1980s, look at what was done when we had the Nuclear Freeze Initiative. Right? Look what was done with June 12th, 1982, when over 1 million people were in Central Park demanding an end to the nuclear arms race. And they were successful. They moved the needle. And 50% of their leadership that day was African-American. Thousands of African-Americans pouring out of Bed-Stuy and Harlem and Brooklyn. People like Shaka Khan and Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee and so many others speaking and performing there, led by the great Reverend Herbert Daughtry and the Black United Front, right? And what do we see happening after that? That was arguably the greatest citizen-led mobilization in our nation's history, the largest peace rally in our nation's history. And there we are after that, where Reagan shifts and Gorbachev, who we just lost, the visionary, wants to finally eliminate nuclear weapons. And if Reagan would have gave up that idiotic Star Wars program, we would have did it, right? But even that, we still got the INF Treaty. We still made progress because of it getting to a point of critical mass. We had politicians that were willing to fight for this because we had their back, and it was the Congressional Black Caucus. It was people like Congressman Ron Dellums out of California who led this fight in Congress, who went to Utah and met with Spencer Kimball, the head of the Mormon Church, to convince him to not let Reagan build the MX program missile and have it in Utah. It was people like Jesse Jackson, who in 84 and 88 in the presidential primaries had a far more anti-nuclear platform than any candidate on either side of the aisle and got millions of votes for it. So we have this history. When I woke up and saw what Putin had said, and saw some of the reactions and then listened to speeches at the UN, I was frustrated. I was depressed. I was scared. But now, where I am right now, where it's almost 9 o'clock at night and I've been in this all day and just stewing on it and thinking about it, now I'm angry. I'm angry about the position we're in right now. That we're supposed to hope deterrence works. We're supposed to hope that Putin doesn't do anything. Our kids deserve better. Our grandkids deserve better. And as somebody who's been in the nuclear field for so long, there's too many amazing people in this field. There's too many amazing people either organizing or like yourselves have been in this fight for years or are younger organizers, too many of us to be where we are right now. And so we have to commit ourselves to educate in a way we haven't done since the 80s. Educate like Helen Caldicott did, where she went on every single channel she could and explained what happens to human beings when nuclear weapons are used. We have to use our gifts the way they did when those filmmakers made the day after, and 100 million people saw it and were shook. We have to mobilize and motivate and inspire and lobby in ways we never have before, because this is unsustainable. And the reality is, Number one, we've seen what that kind of action can do in the 1980s. So we know, we have that history. Many of you lived through it. We're part of it. And we also know that probably nuclear weapons and institutional racism will be with us when we're all gone, still be here. It's not about us. We're doing this for future generations, right? The idea that we can't change this, I don't believe it. And I don't think any of you do either. Be naive. Kids that made it unlivable in the streets during the Vietnam War were naive to think they would end that war, and they did. If you would have told slaves we would have had a black president, they would have said you're nuts. If you would have told people getting their heads bashed in at Stonewall we get marriage equality, they may not have believed you. But we do. We keep going that way because people are willing to fight. And right now, I think the place that we have to focus our attention, all of it, is the TPNW. What we witnessed for that month is the MPT is not working. Article 6 is not producing the results that we wanted. The TPNW had the strongest language. The TPNW provides agency for people to go to their cities, their mayors, their governors, their towns, and get people energized and do something about it, just like the Nuclear Freeze Initiative did. And the TPNW has that simplistic language in a way the Freeze did, where you don't need to be a physics PhD to understand it. It's digestible, and it's a tool. It's not a be-all, end-all. Just like the landmine treaty, just like delegitimizing chemical weapons. And if the NPT was the cornerstone of nuclear disarmament, then the TPNW must be the capstone. And maybe there's some layers to fill in building that house, but that's where we have to go with this. And if we're looking for the connection between peace and race and nuclear weapons, when we look at when the TPNW was first signed, ratified, and went into force, on one side, you had Trump and Putin, two white nationalist authoritarian leaders who had 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal. On the other side, over 120 nations, most of them from the global south, who said, we're done with this. We don't want this. And so it is time, when you look at New York City, who just recently got $415 million away from the pension fund, from nuclear weapons making manufacturers, that is significant. That matters. And ICAN and those groups working on this deserve enormous support and attention and praise in New York.
So I don't need to tell you any more reasons why we need to end racism and why it's important, but I may mention a little bit about that. Renetta mentioned that racism is a system. Because it is systemic, it requires a movement to change it. And I can't remember if this was in Renetta's description, but a key component to ending racism and to having truthful, reckoning discussions about what's going on in our institutions, in our government, in our policies, and that is about power. Racism is prejudice plus the power to keep someone from getting a job or a house, or to get in the country, or to get a passport. So our work is about building power and building a movement that can challenge white supremacy, colonialism, misogyny, and militarism. It is work.
Vernita really shared a sense of how different the reality of peace is for different communities. For some, it is, education and food. And for others, it's ending nuclear armaments. How do we construct the critical mass that is necessary to oppose the powers that continue to profit from militarism and the economics that frankly drive climate change and the people who are, better off because racism continues to divide us? Where do we find, and what more work do we need to do in conversation with one another to build that same kind of critical mass that took over the streets of New York in 1982 and did make a difference.
That building power is a place to start. The Poor People's Campaign, Call for Moral Revival, I think is doing great fusion organizing. I shared with some young folks recently who are doing organizing that if you want to win, and they're doing a local initiative, that you have to make sure every sector in the community is there. Because if every sector is representative, has a representative in your coalition or your network, no elected official can say you left anybody out. If you have the faith community and students and Latino folks and queer folks and libertarian folks and folks from every faith community, of course, then you're in good shape. That's one of the cores of fusion organizing. And it isn't about focusing on one particular issue. It's about building enough power to make demands and win on every issue. So I told them part of what they're trying to do is influence elections. And I said, okay, when you talk to a candidate and you say, yes, our group of people will work for your candidacy and work for you to win, you also have to say, but you better do this, 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 and that. And if you don't, we're coming after you. And you say that before you vote for them, not after they're in office, so that they know and you know from the beginning that we are about using our power to affect what you do as a policymaker. And that is what we expect, and you better come through. Certainly we want to start where people are. Education is important, but not everyone goes to college. Not everyone finishes high school. So how can we get education to really regular folks? And that happens by doing real outreach in communities. Your organization can do that, your church can do that, your civic group can do that. Think about the neighborhood around where you go to church, if you do go to church or synagogue or mosque. Think about the neighborhood near the schools where your kids went, or they might go now, where your kids go. There are places where you can start doing outreach. And don't do those outreach in the communities if you don't know anyone. First, build a relationship with people that live in that community, and then together with them, you can do outreach, you can hold community events, you can do education. Basically, education at a level that fits for that community. Popular education. There are lots of ways to get it across to people. And one really helpful thing to do with everyone, whether they're, a sixth grader in middle school or someone in college, is to have them generate the vision that they want to work for. Talk to me about the kind of world you want to live in. Describe what you would want to feel safe in this neighborhood, and listen to people, listen deeply, and then connect what they've said to some way they can start taking action where they live, work, play, or pray.